Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The King from 2019. Now, I've talked before about how I quite like Shakespeare. Most of Shakespeare is stuff I like. However, one of the exceptions to my like of Shakespeare is not something I dislike, but something I never really could get very into, which was the what's it called, Henriade series of plays. I think it's how it's referred to. Henry the Fourth, Henry the Fifth, Richard the Second. I forget what else. A lot of the more historical retellings that Shakespeare wrote were difficult to digest for me for a very long time. And at the time that I was really, really into reading Shakespeare, it was something that was not as appealing as a lot of his other works. A lot of Shakespeare is fairly melodramatic. It's fairly, he's known for his comedies and tragedies. It's a lot of big emotions, big action, plotting, drama, those sorts of things. It's very entertaining. And that is not absent from his more historical theatrical productions, but it is much more subdued. Certainly there are characters and events from those that are still notable to sort of modern they're in modern cultural parlance. There's certain phrases and things and characters that you see show up in other things, but they're a lot harder to approach, I think, in a very general way than a lot of Shakespeare's other works. This movie is based very loosely on both Henry IV and Henry V and general history from that period in England and France. That's a whole thing that we could talk about for ages, the War of the Roses and all of the sort of history of wars between France and England, the former Norman English conquests and those sorts of things. That's a very interesting topic on its own, but not why I'm here in the first place. I'm here to talk about this movie, which is very interesting because it is not directly saying, it's obviously implied in some ways, but does not say, hey, this is a making of one or multiple of the Shakespearean plays. And I think that works both to its advantage and its disadvantage in some ways. On the one hand, I'm always curious to see new interpretations of Shakespeare's works. Again, something I've talked about before, I think that Shakespeare's works adapt really well to a whole bunch of different settings, different time periods, different, even drastically different framings. It's fascinating even how there's a whole bunch of movies from the 90s and 2000s that are like pop culture movies that are adaptations of Shakespeare. But again, with the Henriade being what it is, it's a little harder to do that with. We're re-entering, thankfully, a period of cinema right now where historical dramas are becoming more popular again, and not merely because they're a vessel for stories that could be told otherwise. In that sense, I mean, we went through sort of a series of events in cinema in particular and media in general from sort of the 70s, where the classical performances of a lot of historical things were sort of became less appealing to popular audiences, became less produced, became, overdone, sometimes done too many times. And especially when it comes to Shakespeare, sometimes you can see Shakespeare too many times and get bored of seeing the same stories. We're dealing with that in other ways of our own remakes of things that came out in the 70s, but that's a whole other can of worms. my point here is we went through sort of a period where historical movies largely died off, and they sort of made a pop culture resurgence in the 90s and 2000s in a very largely poor way, where there are a lot of movies, a lot of media in general, portraying various quote unquote medieval settings, stories, some of them new, some of them reinterpretations of older stories, that were boring, extremely gritty and violent for no reason. It's really a result of this whole period of like grimdark sort of fantasy stuff that was going on throughout the 90s and 2000s that really ruined a lot of historical cinema in general. I could list a whole bunch of movies that are really awful, but I'm not even going to bother because they don't deserve the attention. Currently, we are going through sort of a slight resurgence, and part of the reason I watched this and had it on my list for a while is I have a whole bunch of movies just from like the last 5 years that are, some of them are Shakespeare, some of them are just like historical things that are set in somewhere anywhere between sort of the 800s and like the 1400s. So maybe some of them go a little later. Anyway, that have just come out in the last few years, many of which are on the list for being lauded for being very, very good. This did not get as much attention as a lot of the other ones on my list, but it looked really interesting to me. And what caught my eye initially and what brought me back to it again was that one of the initial things I saw about it was some of the historical combat being done, and we could get into a whole other discussion about the atrocities that have been done to historically accurate combat, and how this looked to be a movie that had a little bit more appreciation for historical combat, historical weaponry, and practical use of you know, the weapons of the era, rather than the sort of theatrical sword fighting and things that have been so pervasive for so long. So I was really interested in that, and then I saw somebody mentioning it again just the other day, and I said, let me go make that my film for this week. So that's how I ended up here. That's a lot of lead-in for talking about this film, but I think it's important context, because this movie does, in a lot of ways, satisfy my curiosities and my interests in those ways, and in a lot of others is sort of disappointing. Doesn't make it a bad film by any means, but let me just say right off the bat, if you're looking for a movie that's very closely based on the Shakespeare plays, or that is particularly historically accurate, this is not going to satisfy you. And to some extent, I was hoping for one or both of those things, and that was not satisfied. There's plenty of, this is a mishmash of Shakespeare bits, extremely loosely used. Its historical accuracy to events, individuals, years, even decades off at times it's just extremely wrong to at least the history as we currently know it. And in terms of just some of the visual elements, it is riddled with anachronisms, armor, weapons, design styles, buildings, architecture that are inappropriate for the time and place that's being portrayed. So in a lot of those ways, it's disappointing. Now, everything that it does, however, is done largely very well. And I think that's where I want to get to it more. Now, one of the things I do find really interesting is in a lot of historical portrayals, whether of Shakespeare or otherwise, it is very infrequently acknowledged how young most of the people are in the stories that come out of medieval Europe. A lot of people are, you think of as adults, and it's like, oh, that guy was 14, or he was 16, or she was 12, or whatever. And there's a whole thing to unpack there, but in terms of cinematic portrayal, I think it makes a huge difference in terms of understanding a character to understand the age of that character. Now, there's a lot to be said about how you unpack like the relative knowledge and education and like life experience of a person of a certain age, 600, 800, 1200 years ago versus today. And that, but fundamentally, there's some underlying biology that always sort of has been the same. There's always a certain level of, mental, psychological development. There's always a certain number of years on the earth that a person has experienced, so on and so forth, that are super important for portraying a person's psychological state, and in particular, that influences how you understand their character development. Part of the reason that Shakespeare's Henriade plays are hard to approach is because they are very focused on both political minutia and character development in a way that is much more realistic and practical than the rest of his works. You see characters develop over the course of their experiences, and it is much less theatrical, to turn a phrase, and much more practical in its portrayal. Now, that's not to say that it's entirely historically accurate, but anyway, I won't get down that rabbit hole too far. I love that this film has a bunch of both younger actors and specifically younger actors who were selected because I think they look particularly young. In particular, Timothée Chalamet, who is now has gotten far enough in his career that people are starting to hate him for reasons that I don't really understand. This was a relatively early film for him, where he was still he was an up-and-coming name, but he was not the big name that he is today. And for a guy who, even now, 5 years later, still looks like quite the baby face, 5 years ago, he was, even more so. He also has a particular visual look and speech affect and a way that he portrays. He uses his facial expressions to very good effect in a way that I think is not often appreciated, that I think makes him very good for the type of role that he's in for here. He's also, flanked by individuals who are either young like him or much, much older. Sometimes people are multiple generations ahead. And so it does put in even starker contrast the difference of his age. And while the people of the time might not have looked as old as the people he's being contrasted with, it serves to influence our understanding of him as a character. This is all to say that this is really indirectly a character study. It's, the Henriade is as well, but this is about watching a young man go through a series of, a series of events that have, from going from already being disillusioned with the world that he's born into and that is being foisted upon him and that he wants little to do with, to going through a series of transformations and reconsiderations of his viewpoints, that is entirely controlled in a way that he doesn't even recognize by sometimes the experiences that he's had or hasn't had, and sometimes his youth. I'm not going to dig too much into that specifically because it gets into the plot, but it is touched on subtly throughout the film. It is a very clear through line throughout the entire narrative, that sort of his arrogance, his willingness to, that he has both strengths and weaknesses that come from the same places. That his willingness to go against the grain, his willingness to not be the person his father was or that his father wanted him to be, his disillusionment with war and death and the loss of people in his life, and wanting to see peace in his time. These are all influences that both help him and harm him, and sometimes in ways that more drastically than he even notices until much later. This all makes for a very compelling and interesting film, and the characters, the actors as selected, I think all serve the narrative they're telling really, really well. There's a lot of smart cinematography that's being used and sound mixing as well to give senses of space and forcefulness and the way that people talk to each other in the spaces that they are in, which is not always super easy to recognize, but I think this movie in particular has some great scenes where you really see, somebody, if you were being less thoughtful about it, you might say, well, that person's being mixed too quiet in the scene. But you give it some consideration, or if you haven't already, and say, oh no, they're quiet on purpose. This is a very intentional decision in the filmmaking, to show that they don't need to speak up, or they don't want to speak up, or they're speaking up too much or too loudly, or the way they interact physically with other people is so important to the storytelling without using words. Now, there are some other problems I see here in this film. It is very dark and heavily color graded, and while there are a few really nice shots in the film that I think are worth noticing, and in particular use of light and darkness, and directed light sources for metaphorical significance, I think are very well done. That said, I do think it still ultimately suffers from being a very gray and brown film. And in fairness, I don't know if I would want it to be shot in complete, ungraded color, but I think they could have done things to make it a little bit more approachable. The overall plot and story sort of, I'm struggling with it still a little bit some hours after watching it, because, as I said, it's already not very historically accurate. It's not very accurate to Shakespeare's tellings either. And it makes a lot of, I don't want to say odd choices, but interesting choices when it chooses to decide what story beats are going to be relevant and important and highlighted and lowlighted. And sometimes it uses those to very good effect, where it tries to put things in more subtly so that you're not paying as much attention to them, so that it can do a more meaningful showing of them later. Other times it's just a little bit muddy in terms of what are we watching for? What is our motivation? Is the motivation to see an overarching story, or is it to watch a character as they experience a series of events that have been foisted upon them? And I think it leans towards the latter, but not entirely. The ultimate sort of tone of the film and the pacing of it, I think, is very good, and that is what kept me engaged, especially when I had some of these relatively minor qualms with it. The tone overall captures a level of darkness and sadness and dourness without overwhelming the tone, without making it seem like everything is truly awful, without even letting the sort of struggles and depression of the main character, or well, of Henry V, who is not always the main character, highlighting those without making them so pervasive as to make the entire movie dour and depressing. And some of that is also just down to the writing and performance of that character, because he does have nuance for all of his flaws. I did want to come a little bit back around to the technical aspects of some of the battle stuff, because I think it's particularly interesting. I'm not going to linger on it too long because it's more interesting to watch than to talk about. But there are both ups and downs with some of the historical combat. There are a couple of scenes that I think are very good in their details, and some of the larger scenes are also very good in their details. However, the larger scenes are where the movie tends to suffer more, where you might have a less fantastical, more realistic understanding and usage of troops, of environments, and of weaponry and armor. But it also is anachronistic enough in certain elements, and even missing some like clear tactical choices that would have been made. Just things that are just absent, like anti-cavalry emplacements and things that are very typical of basically every battle of the time. You don't just... Anyway, I don't need to dig into the specifics of that. I'll be here all day. There's just a few things where it's like, you guys just missed out on... These were opportunities that you didn't take, and maybe you did it for the sake of not muddying your image on screen too much, but especially as somebody who came out of curiosity for some of the historical things they do really well, it is... those things become a little bit more disappointing in contrast. What else do I have to talk about? I think the audio editing, I think I already mentioned, is very good. The music is also, I think, used to very good effect. And the music and the visual and all these other elements that I think work really well do all come into a head in particular to make for some very well concocted emotional scenes, where even characters who you may have mixed feelings about are in circumstances of deep emotional turmoil. And those are, I think there's a few in there that are done very, very well. And especially for a genre and a time that is not usually as much focused on that, I think that's especially worthy of note. I don't think I have too much else necessarily to say in specifics. I think this is a fairly strong movie. This is directed by, or it's written by Joel Edgerton, who's known more as an actor, and it's directed by David Michaud. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but who I don't think has a lot of particular credits to his name, but I may be mistaken on that. But it's an interesting enough visual styling that for my qualms with some of the color grading and stuff, I think the cinematography is noteworthy, that I'd be looking out for his name again. Overall, I think this is a pretty strong film. It is on Netflix, so if you've got that, it's pretty easy to get your hands on. For a movie that has a runtime of nearly 2.5 hours, I think it keeps a fairly good pace that makes it very satisfying to watch, if this is your style of thing. If it's not, then it might be a little bit too historical, too down and gritty to draw a general audience, big air quotes, but I think it's pretty good. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.